Hi everyone. First, I want to start by thanking Professor McDonald for inviting me to say a few words about my practice and my interests around rurality within the context of this contemporary Canadian art course. My name is Alexander Rondo. I am a queer artist and curator from a very small rural farming community in northeastern so-called Ontario. Um, it's about a six-ish hour drive northeast of Toronto for context. And where I'm from is called Kearns Township, and it's probably about a farming community of around 300 people. Definitely more cows than people kind of vibe. And it's on the outskirts of a small town called Newliskerd. Um, this is on the past, present, and future home of the Ojibwe Cree and Anishinaabe peoples within the Robinson Huron Treaty Land. So currently I am a candidate in the graduate program here at OCAD, specifically the Criticism Curatorial Practice MFA program, where my current thesis looks at three queer, trans, and or two-spirit identified artists making work that is both physically and conceptually located within northeastern Ontario. So namely, I'm looking at Ricky Strapp, Lucy Woke, and Tyler Matheson. Um, I did my BFA in photography studies at Ryerson University, and between my BFA and my MFA, I worked at the Near North Mobile Media Lab in North Bay, which is a nonprofit artist-run center dedicated to developing a sort of network and infrastructure for media artists in the north, beyond North Bay, serving Northern Ontario as a whole. I've done a few independent curatorial projects. I've had some exhibitions, um, and I've also worked on a few co-curatorial projects, specifically with Robin, actually, as a duo called Minor Hockey Curatorial, but I'll circle back to that later. As an artist and a curator, I'm really interested in thinking through specifically queerness in rural Northern Ontario. I do treat my artistic and curatorial practices as being actually quite separate and distinct, and acknowledging the different sort of histories and methodologies and contexts at play in those as separate sort of methodological approaches to the interest of queerness in the North. Um, a few key terms that really anchor some of my thinkings around rurality, and this little presentation is pretty specifically seen through the lens of queerness and rurality, and more specifically Northern Ontario in the context of rurality. So three terms that emerge here are metronormativity, which you may already be familiar with these, so I'll just give a quick glance over. This is a term by Jack Halberstam that sort of posits the urban as the default and operating norm, into which rurality is the subordinate, and the rural is considered as the closet of the otherwise queer urban space. So, in my personal example, the example um, of Kearns Township being, in this case, the conceptual closet of Toronto. And then, sorry, within that we understand sort of a queer compulsory outmigration from rurality to urbanity. So we have this narrative that queerness can't exist in the rural, queerness has to therefore move to the urban center to be safe, seen, acknowledged, out. Um, and then the inverse to that would be Scott Herring's notion of queer anti-urbanism, which is in fact the antithesis of the queer outmigration, in which queerness then pivots towards rurality and actually finding harmony in a queer rural life and existence and these sort of ideological underpinnings of what it might mean for queerness to exist outside of the urban center and in the rural space, and the sort of critical underpinnings that come along with that. Um, and it's also like a consideration of rural queer epistemologies, and the sort of regional queer productions that can exist in the rural. So how queer culture is otherwise inherently sort of um, not place specific, though culturally culturally we might understand queerness to be um, urban, as the term metronormativity again sort of points to, but in a queer anti-urbanist sort of positionality, we can actually see that there are many ways in which queerness can in fact exist in its own capacity in the in rural settings, and the sort of cultural production that comes along with that. And specifically is this term critical rusticity, also by Scott Herring, which is essentially a queer anti-urbanist take on aesthetics, um, and essentially applying a lens of criticality to otherwise rustic aesthetics, objects, artworks, places, spaces, etc. And applying this lens of criticality in the context of queerness to rusticity sort of offers a more nuanced and complex reading of the intersections of gender and gender identity, gender expression, sex, sexuality, race, class, religion, culture, region, as these sort of ideological and identity-based positions start to intersect with the vernacular culture of rural places. Um, so those are three key terms that come up often in my thinking and my research and practice. Um, Here are a few texts, specifically books on rurality. Again, pretty much all these are in the context of queerness. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just kind of like a greatest hits, excuse me, books that definitely are highly recommended. Queer Ecology is one of my favorites. Queering the Countryside was great. Um, Queer Anti-Urbanism is a huge one. That's the one that references both critical rusticity and the namesake queer anti-urbanism. Prairie Fairies is actually more of like a historiographical account of queerness, and it's less so a theoretical positioning, but I think in order to first have that theoretical base, we do need to in fact know the histories of the communities and the places that we're thinking through. And also very important in the context of rurality is to think through queer settler colonialism and the legacies that queerness has, and the sort of advancements of colonial projects, and queerness's complicity in colonial undertakings, and to not sort of look over those subject positions, and how queerness in fact enables and perpetuates these colonialist systems of power. So I'll jump into a couple of my art projects. This is a project I realized in 2016. It was called Making an Offering, and this was the first time I actually started to think through my own subject position as being queer, and from rural northern Ontario. And this particular example also being francophone and how that relates to queerness. So this was part of a solo exhibition I had during the Contact Photography Festival. Then the 2017 festival, it had a featured exhibition that was curated by Heather Rigg. So this work was a series of photographs. I think there was 13 in total, that looked at the sort of intersubjective relationship between queerness, the francophone language, and the rural north. So if any of you are familiar with Canadian French, you'll know that the swear words in Canadian French quite specifically are references or nomenclature from the Catholic Church. So for example, Chris or aussi or kalis, they're all sort of words from the sort of sphere of Catholicism. And pretty interestingly, in French, there is no positive language to describe queerness. There's no translation for the word queerness. There's no translation for the word gay. There is just no language. It's a sort of categorical erasure. There is, however, a lot of pejorative slurs. So, for example, fif, which would translate to faggot, or tapet, which is roughly translated to like a feminine man with a broken wrist. And in Canadian French, with the sort of specific Catholic swear words, we see these operating in tandem. So it's Christe tapet, ostifif, and there's this dual sort of linguistic and sort of grammatological oppression between the categorical erasure of queerness within the French language, and it's tethered to Catholicism. And so something that I looked at was like the vernacular aesthetics of Catholicism that were so prominent in the area that I was raised in and where I'm from, and my sort of deep, forced, sort of indoctrinated upbringing in a Catholic family / Catholic school, Catholic community, even though I myself am not religious whatsoever. It was still heavily imposed and the governing sort of norm. So I became really interested in the visual material and vernacular material within this sort of specific denomination, and quite often we see these textiles, colorful textiles that are used in different masses, or each holding different temporal meaning, and the colors of which are symbolic. And so I decided to invert the traditional dynamic between queerness and Catholicism as it relates to this sort of like connectivity to place. So in the sort of natural landscape around where I'm from, I put in these textiles as these sort of surrogate self-portraits that look totally out of place, but sort of begin to point towards or conjure or mimic a Catholic, yet somehow also queer reading of these materials. And we see throughout the series these echoes of trinities, so pairings of three, the three trinity echoed again here, the subtle cross, the francophone flag green color, and the series ultimately just changed the subject position of, rather than looking at queerness at odds with the place in which it is found, it is in fact now this sort of Catholic ornamentation that we see at odds with its place. This is a project I'm currently working on, tentatively called Woodwork. This will be for a solo exhibition at the WKP Kennedy Gallery in North Bay coming April 2021. These two images here are photographs that will be printed and displayed, whereas this is just documentation of a sculptural work. Thinking here through, again, vernacular epistemologies and vernacular aesthetic culture, and thinking through cultural systems of value and asymmetries of value in different cultural undertakings. So in the example of woodwork, I'm thinking through the cultural significance and cultural history sort of embedded within wood. In many rural areas, northern Ontario included, forestry is one of the largest and dominant hiring and job forces and job sectors. And when we start to think of the traditional lumberjack or who that woodworker might be, we immediately sort of think of like a strong, burly man capable of working within the landscape. And then when we start to think of how that becomes the enacting norm in many small northern or rural communities, when the dominant job sector asks of a certain type of employee, and what that heavily gendered sort of, I guess in many ways, stereotype starts to become at odds with someone who, like myself, is queer and inherently transgresses against those odds and is perhaps seen as not able to fulfill the tasks of the lumberjack. So I start to think about wood as both product, um, sorry, no, more so specifically masculinity as both product and worker of the landscape. Um, and then thinking through perhaps what it means to not actually live up to that, or what it means to not adhere to that sort of rigid phenomenological relationship to wood. In this case, we see kindling. Here we see a cord of wood here. And how a queer body might relate to these materials, and what are actually different sort of epistemologies that could be sort of compared to the natural, or the dominant rather, way that someone might engage with these materials. And I'm thinking pretty specifically about failure as a self-reflexive modality in cultural production, and the sort of failure of working with these materials as prescribed in forming itself cultural value in the context of producing an exhibition, and the asymmetries of value between actual woodwork and, for example, being a lumberjack, quote unquote, um, versus being an artist and working with wood, and the different phenomenological sort of orientations in which would lead to that moment and to those asymmetries. Okay, so moving on to some curatorial projects. This was the first curatorial exhibition I had done, excuse me, that also sort of think through queerness in the North or queerness in rurality. This was an exhibition that I had done in 2018 in Pete's Dam Park, which is in the countryside of New Liskeard. It's a series of hiking trails. The main one is about roughly 1.5 kilometers. And I invited 15 artists from across Ontario to mount this exhibition that sort of centered issues of identity and the landscape, or identity in place, or identity as it moves through place, moves through the land, etc. So the three sort of major themes were structural and systemic violence against Indigenous women specifically, and queer geographies and queer temporalities, and the harmful nature of resource extraction industries towards femme bodies. So the 15 artists were spread out through this 1.5 kilometer hiking trail. And so, for example, we have a piece here by Ashley Gannett, this work by Lucy Woke, and this is one of the artworks specifically I'm writing about for my thesis right now. A performance piece by Marcus Marriott, who I think might actually be in this class. If you are, hello Marcus. And a installation piece here by Katie Huxon. Okay, so moving on to the aforementioned minor hockey curatorial duo between myself and Robin. This was our first exhibition together. Previously, Robin and I had sort of unofficially began minor hockey as a fundraising programming event for the Whitewater Gallery, which is an artist-run center in North Bay. But this was an exhibition that we have produced independently as co-curators. So the exhibition included works by Dominic Pinney, seen here, Dana Danger, Tyler Matheson, Adrian Crossman, Walter Scott, and behind the frame, which we can't actually see here, was Jordan Stewart. And this sort of is actually a really great example of what I was talking about earlier with critical rusticity and Scott Herring's sort of writings around queer anti-urbanism. So the exhibition sort of looked at the sort of extraordinary but also extraordinary fusion of queer aesthetics with vernacular northern cultural aesthetics. So if we were to see here, we have a moose antler with a Leather-Made strap-on by Dana Danger. And we have hockey sticks over here by Tyler Matheson that have been covered in glitter. Adrian making a hockey jersey slash sport jersey that holds the words "no future," kind of again pushing back on this sort of like conception of metronormativity, that queerness has to in fact leave rurality and to move southbound or towards urbanity to in fact be able to thrive or exist. And the artists were, I think, in bringing them together, we were interested in both readings and also misreadings of queerness in the North. So, for example, two of the artists in the exhibition weren't themselves queer, but contributed to, I think, the dialogue in an important way that also posited misreadings as equally of interest in the context of queerness. A second minor hockey curatorial project was Pressure Cracks. This is an exhibition that we did for the Ice Follies Biennial, which takes place on frozen Lake Nipissing in North Bay every second winter. We were approached by the Near North Mobile Media Lab to produce an exhibition for Ice Follies. This is a biennial that was initiated by Animatogzy, which is a performance group out of Nipissing First Nation. And we also have the Whitewater Galleries installation, which you can kind of see here. To the right of this frame would be Studio Nude Beach's installation, and it's a group of galleries and local community organizations that come together to produce a series of exhibitions on the frozen lake, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly difficult to install, but equally rewarding once it's done. So for this exhibition, we included works by Meg Fahaley, who is in fact a undergraduate student in the Indigenous Visual Culture program at OCAD. Emily Pelstring's work, which was only visible at nighttime, a projection onto the ice. Jenna Dawn McClellan's soft sculptures, and inside was a loop of John Sasaki and Christine Negus' video works. The exhibition namesake came from a pressure crack, which you can actually see here, which is the sort of precarious and unstable result of rapid temperature flux. So if, for example, during the day, the temperature shifts from being too hot to too cold at night, the ice can rupture quite violently and create these dramatic, almost like a huge explosion had gone off. And these fault lines can go on for kilometers throughout the ice. And so we sort of took that as like a harbinger for precarity within structures that we otherwise might rely on, be they social, cultural, ecological structures, and thinking equally about this notion of precariousness and structures in which are to be upheld and maintained, and which are to be actively dismantled, and the affective charge of either in this particular case. Okay, so this is something I'm really excited about. Between Pheasants Contemporary is a new project I'm working on. It's an experimental presentation space in the pheasant slash chicken duplex coop. in my parents' farm up in Kearns Township. So from the outside, it looks like a singular structure, but inside this wall here divides the pheasant coop. And on the other side of this wall, we can see here the chicken coop. Pheasants are kind of a lesser common farm animal, but they're known for their beautiful plumage. And we have them as day-old chicks in mid-June all the way through late October, which means that the pheasant side of the coop is vacant for half the year. And I had this moment, I was like, oh, I should curate an exhibition in the coop. And then I realized that actually long term there's more potential and that this could be an ongoing presentation space. So the mandate for Between Pheasants is specifically to champion contemporary artistic practices and curatorial practices in Northern Ontario and to connect regional audiences, with access to contemporary presentations and exhibitions and programming which are otherwise unavailable in the area. There is a public art gallery in this community, but as you might imagine, for a public municipal gallery, it is mostly paintings of the lake and more geared towards fine art and hobbyist art than professional contemporary artists. So I kind of conceived of BPC as a space to host and present works by contemporary practicing artists. This will be the first exhibition. I haven't actually publicly announced this yet. I have teased at upcoming programs, but I haven't officially announced anything, so you all are the first to know. The first exhibition will be opening in March. It is curated by myself. It is called Relentless Remembering, which is a casual line in Eve Tuck and Ceres text, a glossary of haunting. I had sort of been thinking about the potential of this exhibition in the space, and then, like I said earlier, realized that it could go on to be an actual ongoing gallery space. And so after this exhibition, my goal for Between Pheasants is to actually step back and take on strictly an administrative role and the role of a facilitator to hand over programming to the vision of artists and curators that will be presenting in the space. So this first exhibition is a 3-person group show with artists Meg Fahaley, Andrew Harding, and Luke Mataford. I don't have examples of all their works, I just have Luke's here. The 3 artists share within their practice the sort of reappropriation of otherwise aesthetics of erasure within the context of QT2S, so queer, trans, two-spirit, self-identified communities and individuals. So, for example, Meg Fahaley's work is a series of moldcast letters that spell out "greed is good," which is a maxim from the 1987 film Wall Street, and the sort of fleshy and rotting presentation of Meg's recast of the words, the the maxim sort of anachronistically actually echoes more of a warning than it does a mantra. And then Andrew, a queer Métis artist, used what he described as a native gas station T-shirt that he found exactly in a gas station, which depicted sort of like a very general take on sort of appropriating indigenous cosmologies and visual culture that he then reworked into this incredibly beautiful, delicate but tense sculptural piece. And these gas station memorabilia are kind of a paradox in that they at once appropriate but also actively erase indigeneity and present indigeneity as a relic or a memory or a past or something that is otherwise forgotten without these sort of like commodified capitalist souvenirs. Um, and they're really reminiscent of these, like, like the summer family road trip, which in and of itself is an industry sort of rooted in the mid 20th century, specifically advancement of colonial projects of really imbricating and moving settler whiteness into non-urban spaces. And then finally, Luke Matterford's work, I Haunt the Prairies and They Haunt Me Back, we see an excerpt here, brings together a selection of objects and images that relate to specifically his upbringing in rural Saskatchewan. Um, there's an image that really struck me from this work. It's a Xerox print that is a, a photograph, which is a black and white photograph on paper of a big open prairie field with a prairie sky. And upon it, he wrote an inscription that reads, "I'm still your fag," which in the overlapping contrast of the inscription, "I'm still your fag," and the sort of landscape photograph, we would actually otherwise conceive of these things being mutually exclusive of each other and at odds with each other. But remarkably, in this particular image, Luke's use of the word fag is in fact his tether to rurality rather than a driving force away from rurality. So all the artists are looking at these very specific aesthetics or cultural signifiers of erasure and changing the sort of semiotic reading of those signs and turning the aesthetics of erasure back upon themselves and using the specific moment of erasure as a self-reflexive modality to actually, in fact, resiliently reinscribe their respective queer and two-spirit identities within that particular moment of aesthetic circulation. Okay, I think that was the last slide. So I'm very happy to have had the chance to speak about my work with you all. If any of you want to discuss anything further, I'm very happy to leave my contact information with Robin to then be passed on to anyone who would like to talk about any of this at length. I could go on forever and ever and ever. I'm obviously very invested in thinking through queerness in the rural north. And yeah, I think that's it. I'll wrap it up here. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good night.